Hey everybody, this is the introduction and stuff at the beginning of the book of John E. Roemer's Analytical Foundations of Marxian Economic Theory. This book is originally from the year 1981. Contents: Introduction, Methodology Summary. Chapter 1, Equilibrium and Reproducibility, the Linear Model, with the headings: a brief review, a more complete definition of Marxian equilibrium. 3. A model of imperfect competition. 4. Some dynamics in the linear Leontief model. Chapter 2. Reproducibility and exploitation, a general model. 1. Introduction. 2. Specification of the model. 3. The existence of reproducible solutions. 4. The fundamental Marxian theorem. 5. Exploitation, labor values, joint products, and scarce inputs. 6. The social determination of the value of labor power. 7. The interaction of class consciousness and the choice of technique. Summary. Appendix 1. Existence of reproducible solutions with the value of labor power socially determined. Appendix 2. Necessary and sufficient conditions for the validity of the fundamental Marxian theorem. Section 9, Outline of Problem. Section 10, The Model. Section 11, The Fundamental Marxian Theorem. Conclusion. Chapter 3, The Equalization of Profit Rates in Marxian General Equilibrium. Heading 1, Introduction. 2. Marxian Equilibrium with Finance Capital Market. 3. Summary, what drives profit rate equalization in the Marxian model. 4. Positive profits, positive exploitation, and the theory of profits. Chapter 4. Viable and progressive technical change and the rising rate of profit. With the headings 1. Introduction. 2. The value and price rates of profit. 3. The effect of technical change on the rate of profit. 4. Progressive and viable technical change and steady state growth. 5. Summary. Appendix: Frobenius-Perron eigenvalue theorems. Chapter 5, Continuing Controversy on the Falling Rate of Profit, Fixed Capital, and Other Issues. Section 1, The Need for Microfoundations, Methodology. Section 2, Miscellaneous Arguments Against Occhio's Theorem. Section 3, The Rising Rate of Profit with Fixed Capital, a Special Case. 4, The General Case of Fixed Capital, the von Neumann Model. Section 5, Conclusion. Chapter 6, Changes in the Real Wage and the Rate of Profit. Section 1, Introduction. 2, Technical Change with Constant Relative Shares. 3, A Model of Relative Share Constancy within Sectors. 4, Technical Change and Class Struggle. Efficient versus Controlling Technical Changes. 5, Summary. Chapter 7, The Law of Value and the Transformation Problem. Section 1, Marx's Project, Where Do Profits Come From? 2. Marx and the Subsistence Wage. 3. The Law of Value. 4. The Transformation Problem. 5. Summary. Chapter 8, The Transformation Correspondence. Heading 1, Introduction. 2. The Transformation Correspondence. 3. Some applications of the Transformation Correspondence. 4. Summary. Chapter 9, Simple Reproduction, Extended Reproduction, and Crisis. 1. Introduction. 2. Simple Reproduction. 3. Extended Reproduction. 4. 3 Marxian Crises. 5. A one-sector model. 6. Summary. Chapter 10, Summing Up and New Directions. Okay, so that's the table of contents. Acknowledgements. A variety of people have influenced the work that appears in this book. Over the past several years, I have had many stimulating discussions with Duncan Foley. Although they have not perhaps been about the Marxian model in a way that forced me to face them. Excuse me. I fucked that up. Over the past several years, I have had many stimulating discussions with Duncan Foley, although they have not perhaps been absorbed according to his design. Leo Hurwitz posed certain questions about the Marxian model in a way that forced me to face them. Roger Howe and Andrew Moskovel have been consistent and faithful listeners and critics. Various chapters have been read by Maghnad Desai, Herbert Gintis, Victor Goldberg, and Josep Maria Figueroa, and their comments have affected the final draft. Cheryl Stark typed the manuscript with speed and accuracy and without complaint. John Roemer. Okay, so here we go. Introduction. First section, methodology. Oh. Endnotes again. Footnote. My ideas on methodology have been influenced by many conversations with Duncan Foley and by the approach of Lakatos, 1976, to the development of mathematical ideas. Indeed, I can claim no great originality for whatever seems novel or useful in this introduction, as I am not sure where the ideas of Foley and Lakatos end and mine begin. End footnote. Although a book in mathematical Marxian economics is no longer a unique phenomenon, its author must still confront the opinion held in many circles, both Marxian and non-Marxian, that such an endeavor is a contradiction in terms. Two lines of defense are available. 1. That Marx himself was not against the use of mathematical methods. 2. That regardless of Marx's position, these methods are appropriate to aid in understanding the social phenomena with which Marx was concerned. Although what Marx believed on this question should not settle the issue, if we consider Marxism to be a science and not a religion, it nevertheless appears that Marx was a supporter of the use of mathematical methods in economics. This is shown by the work of Leon Smolinski, 1973, who studied Marx's unpublished as well as published manuscripts for his views on the matter. Sorry, I was looking up Leon Smolinski and I couldn't find him. Smolinski reports that there was, quote, not a single injunction against mathematical economics in Marx's published or unpublished writings, end quote. Leon Smolinski. Moreover, Lafargue attributes to Marx the statement, quote, a science becomes developed only when it has reached the point where it can make use of mathematics, end quote. Lafargue. Still, the opposing circumstances evidence remains that Marx made very little use of formal mathematics beyond arithmetic in his work. As Marx studied algebra and calculus quite extensively in his later years, why did he not use these tools? Two main reasons are suggested by Smolinski. His economic theories have already been formulated before his mathematical studies became intensive, and his mastery of the application of these tools to economic models was very slight. Indeed, Smolinski provides rather incriminating evidence with regard to the second reason, by showing how inept was Marx's effort to analyze the algebraic relationship between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit in an unpublished version of Capital, Volume 3, Chapter 3, entitled quote, the mathematical treatment of the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit. Footnote, Smolinski gives a third reason, with which I do not completely agree, for the lack of mathematics in Marx, that the type of discrete and continuous phenomena with which Marx was concerned were not best modeled with calculus and algebra, but rather with linear algebra and finite mathematics, and he had little or no knowledge of these fields. 3. End footnote. Regardless of Marx's position, however, mathematics is a useful tool in Marxian economics. To the extent that abstraction and models are useful, so is mathematics. This would seem self-evident. Several objections nevertheless remain. The most cogent of these seems to be that although mathematics may be useful, it does not accomplish any analytical task that cannot be done without it. 2. That the essential ideas of Marxian social science cannot be mathematized. Objection 1 does not pass the empirical test of the last century's research in Marxian economics. The use of mathematical techniques can clarify relationships in an unambiguous way. Without these techniques, only intuition can be a guide. But the intuition of two people may contradict each other. When both are forced to state their beliefs in a common mathematical language, there is an objective standard for deciding which is correct. This is seen in Marxian economics most clearly in the endless discussions of the transformation problem and the theory of the falling rate of profit. Recent theoretical statements of the problems have resolved many, if not all, the debates. After the mathematics has done its job, it is often possible to state the proof verbally, that is, to avoid the quote mathematics. Hindsight, however, differs from foresight. If a tool acts as a catalyst, it enables us to see how to perform the task for which it was intended, but without its use, more power to it. A related point to objection 1 is, as Jacob Schwartz, 1961, put it, that, quote, mathematics, in doing its good works, has a way of drawing attention to itself, end quote. This is perhaps at the heart of the objection of many Marxists to the use of mathematics. They fear the introduction of the tool distracts attention from burning social issues of the underlying investigation and gives the inquiry a game-like character. This is no doubt a danger, but the reciprocal accusation can just as well be made against those Marxists who write pages of, quote, dialectical reasoning, reveling in the Talmudic play possible in that medium. Any methodology can be abused. Objection 2 is a more serious point, for certainly mathematics can play only a partial role in Marxian social science, or in any social science, or in any science. Indeed, the essential aspect of a science is confrontation of theory and facts, and mathematics does not produce facts. More specifically, the historical materialist method is central to Marxism, and mathematics does not produce history. The question of the applicability of mathematics, then, must necessarily be limited to its role in Marxian social theory, a theory being a way of interpreting historical fact. Here one must distinguish between a theory and its models. In my terminology, a theory is not by its nature mathematical. Theories live in an intuitional domain. One tests the consistency of a theory by making models that are schematic representations of the theory and that may use mathematics. A model allows statements to be made that have an undeniable truth value within the model. Statements made in a theory do not have this logical status. There may be several models of a single theory, some of which verify the theory, others which nullify it. For example, now that some have produced models of the falling rate of profit, FRP theory, that nullify the theory, as in chapters 4 and 5 of this book, others are trying to produce models that verify it. If the pro-falling rate of profit models are successfully produced, they will clearly differ from the anti-falling rate of profit models in their assumptions, and such a confrontation will force a more careful refinement of the underlying theory. That is, a theory living in the domain of intuition necessarily has a certain vagueness. The vagueness is brought into sharp focus by the articulation of contradicting models of the same theory. It is in this case that, quote, mathematics or models cannot capture all that is contained in a theory. A model is necessarily one schematic image of a theory, and one must not be so myopic as to believe other schematic images cannot exist. Nevertheless, this is not a reason not to use mathematics in trying to understand a theory. For as has been pointed out above, the production of different and contradicting models of the same theory can be the very process that directs our focus to the gray areas of the theory. It should be underscored that this discussion applies only to the use of models to test the consistency of a social theory, not the usefulness for accuracy of a theory. The usefulness or accuracy of a theory is tested by confronting it, or its models, with history and data. Using the distinction that has been stated above between a theory and its models, it is now possible to admit the sense in which objection 2 is viable, because a social theory, by this definition, is a proposal for ordering and understanding a particular set of historical occurrences and behavior. It does not have the status of a statement in logic. A model, however, contains logical statements. Hence, a model can never replace a theory. That is, a model can never capture every nuance the theory might imply. We might construct models that attempt to capture, schematically, what we conceive of as some of the postulates of the historical materialist theory, in order to examine whether certain conclusions logically follow from a historical materialist perspective. Nevertheless, no model can ever hope to capture fully the theory of historical materialism. It is as if a theory is an object in an infinite dimensional space, and a model gives us a projection of this object onto a small subspace. Different models produce different projections. With more models, more projections. We get a more accurate feeling for the implications and the limits of the theory, but we can never capture every dimension of the theory from its models. With sufficient modeling, however, we may come to feel that we have exhausted the interesting content of the theory, and so for all practical purposes it is understood. If one adopts this epistemological posture, it becomes clear that although it is true that models can never entirely capture a theory, this is not a reason not to build models of the theory. Quite the opposite. Models provide perhaps the best way of trying to explore the theory. Thus, although objection 2 is valid in the sense described, it does not follow that mathematical modeling should be abandoned. We have addressed the issue of whether models can necessarily capture everything contained in theories. Another level of objection 2 is that there are specific concepts of Marxian theories, such as class, power, struggle, consciousness, hegemony, and so on, that are not so amenable to mathematical modeling as are the notions of price, quantity, technology, and so on. This, I think, is not the case. The obvious explanation is that we cannot imagine, perhaps, how to mathematize, quote, class struggle, unquote, because no one has ever tried, or, more accurately, there is no social science that has tried for 100 years to do so. But even if we can mathematize the notion of, say, class, is there a purpose to it? Here the proponents of objection 2 and objection 1 might unite and say, quote, class cannot be mathematized, but even if you can do it, what will be gained in the process? The subtle issues concerning class cannot be clarified with mathematical modeling, end quote. However, I would argue as an example that the inability of Marxists to understand what has transpired in the socialist economy since 1917 is intimately related to an imprecise and vague notion of class. We have a theory of class, and we have understood many dimensions of the theory. But now a historical experience has occurred that exposes our ignorance of the complete theory. That is, there are dimensions of the notion of class that have only become important to our understanding of reality since 1917, and we have little intuition with regard to what is happening in those dimensions. It is time, therefore, to attempt to produce models of the theory of class that can enlighten us as to those hidden dimensions. To be specific, Soviet society is developed in a way that no Marxist would have predicted in 1885 or 1917. There is no agreement among Marxists on the extremely fundamental and apparently simple question, what is the Soviet Union, capitalist, socialist, or something else? To resolve this question, one must understand how to define class when the means of production are not privately owned, investment is centrally planned, and so on. In other words, our accepted theory of what constitutes class is exposed as being vague when we try to explain the theory to a new situation. When we try to apply the theory to a new situation, namely Soviet society, when the vagueness of a theory becomes critical in our ability to use the theory to interpret reality, it is an appropriate time to tighten our understanding of it by constructing models of the theory. Not only do I think that the Marxian notion of class can be modeled, more important, I think that such modeling can illuminate the gray areas of the theory and enable us to understand the class nature of modern Soviet-like, or let us say, socialist societies. Perhaps a historical parallel is useful here. The prime example of modeling an ethereal concept in Marxian economics is the theory of exploitation. Exploitation is a concept like class, power, struggle, consciousness. It might appear to be a concept that mathematics could only reify, but not clarify. Marx wished to understand how exploitation could exist under capitalism, a mode of production in which exchanges are mediated through competitive markets. Under feudalism and slavery, the existence of exploitation posed no riddle because of the overtly coercive mechanism for the expropriation of labor. If one had lived under feudalism, the theory of exploitation as the expropriation of surplus labor would have seemed utterly clear. It is only with the advent of competitive markets that the vagueness becomes apparent in this theory. How is surplus labor expropriated when there is no corvée, but only a labor market? If you ask the wage worker how long he must work to reproduce his family, he will reply, quote, 40 hours a week. If you ask the serf, he will reply, only 3 days for my family, the rest of the time I slave for that jerk on the hill, unquote. Marx resolved the vagueness in the received theory of exploitation by constructing an essentially mathematical model and extending the applicability of the exploitation theory to capitalism. To review this example, before the advent of capitalism, one might have held that the theory of exploitation necessarily entailed a coercive institution for the exchange of labor. If exploitation means the expropriation of slave labor, if exploitation means the appropriation of surplus labor, and of one class by another, then the historical experience of slave and feudal societies would lead one to believe that a necessary aspect of the theory of exploitation was a coercive institution for labor exchange. Marx observed that this perception of the theory did not work for capitalism. He wished to claim that exploitation was still occurring, despite the absence of a coercive institution for labor exchange. Indeed, that is the motivation for Marx's effort to explain the existence of exploitation in the presence of, quote, fair or competitive markets. One response to capitalist reality was to say that there could not be exploitation because markets were competitive. This, in fact, is the essence of the neoclassical approach. Marx's approach was, in the terms of his discussion, to say that our previous perception evolved false inferences concerning hidden dimensions of the theory. As long as society had experienced only with coercive institutions for organizing labor exchange, it was not necessary to understand precisely what the theory looked like along that dimension. Now that history has given us a mode of production with, at least in principle, a non-coercive labor exchange mechanism, a competitive labor market, one must attempt to model the theory to see what it predicts in this new situation. Marx's discovery was that the theory of exploitation works through more mysterious channels than one might have thought. Exploitation is a logically consistent idea even in the presence of competitive markets. An important task for Marxists today is to extend the theory of exploitation so as to be able to evaluate whether exploitation can exist under socialism. To this extent, a model-building mathematical approach should be as useful as it was for Marx. Indeed, we find ourselves today in a theoretical predicament quite analogous to the one in which Marx found himself. We have a fairly good understanding of the dimension of the theory of exploitation and can be labeled the, quote, degree of coerciveness of the institution of labor exchange, end quote. The dimension of the theory that we have not had cause to examine until the last 60 years is the one labeled, quote, public ownership of the means of production, end quote. Just as neoclassical economists are incorrect in assuming that the presence of a labor market means exploitation cannot exist, so Marxists, or more generally historical materialists, would be incorrect in assuming that the absence of private ownership implies the abolition of exploitation. We lack, however, a model of exploitation under these conditions that can help us evaluate if, in fact, the theory is still applicable under socialism. Judgments on the issue of whether exploitation exists in the Soviet Union differ widely among Marxists because we have no precise understanding of the relevant dimensions of the exploitation theory. The end of the apology for the mathematical and model-building method in Marxian economics. This ends the apology for the mathematical model-building method in Marxian economics. Doubtless most of these arguments apply to social science as a whole, and doubtless many have been stated more completely and with more sophisticated philosophical apparatus elsewhere. I feel, nevertheless, that it is necessary to include such a statement here. Two more important methodological issues remain concerning the approach I have taken: the validity of micro-foundations, a micro-foundations approach in Marxian economics, and the validity of an equilibrium approach. The micro-foundations approach consists in deriving the aggregate behavior of an economy as a consequence of the actions of individuals who are postulated to behave in some specified way. I have taken this approach throughout the book. For example, in the chapters on the falling rate of profit, it is postulated that a technical innovation is introduced only if it increases profits for a capitalist. This micro approach is different from a macro approach, which might say, we postulate that technical change takes the form of an increasing aggregate organic composition of capital. From the micro vantage point, one is not allowed to postulate an increasing organic composition of capital unless one can show the individual entrepreneurial mechanism leads to it. Marxists might question the micro-foundations methodology because one of the forceful points of Marx's theory is that the individual is not the relevant unit to examine. It is the class. This might lead one to try and build a model in which classes are the atoms of the system. I think it should be possible to produce such a model, but I do not believe that model would be contradictory to the ones I have described in this book. The reason is this: individuals act as members of a class rather than as individuals should be a theorem in Marxian economics, not a postulate. Marx's point is that despite the capitalist incarnation as a human being, he or she is forced by the system to act as an agent for the self-expansion of capital. Workers similarly may have their individual yearnings and habits, but conditions of life force them to acquire a class consciousness and to act, at times, as agents of the working class as a whole, and not as their own agent. This might be the situation, for instance, in a strike, where the strikers take great chances for the good of the strike, which are not personally worthwhile. In each case, Marx has claimed that although people exist organically as individuals, we can conclude that they act as members of classes. It is in this sense that the class behavior is a theorem and not a postulate of the Marxian theory. Bracket, I have discussed this particular theorem of class consciousness elsewhere. See Roemer 1978b and Roemer 1979a in bracket. Thus, it is not antithetical to Marxian theory to produce models using the micro-foundations approach. In particular, I suggest that one theorem of Marxism is a, quote, micro-foundations of class, end quote, analysis. Taking the argument a step further, I would say that it is not only admissible but important to take a micro-foundations approach in Marxian theory. A common error in Marxian discussions is functionalism, to assume that a mechanism necessarily exists to perform actions that must be performed to reproduce the system. But more simply, if the occurrence of X will further the reproduction of capitalist relations, then X occurs. For example, if racist attitudes exist among the working class, then capital will be strong. Therefore, capitalism foments racism. What is missing here is a description of the mechanism by which this is accomplished. It may be in the interests of capital as a whole to maintain discriminatory wage differentials for black and white workers of equal productivity, but why should the individual, profit-maximizing capitalist, respect this differential when he or she can increase profits by unraveling the differential? That is, by hiring only black workers at a slightly higher wage than they are receiving under the racist regime. If we postulate capitalism as a system of anarchic competitive capitals, each bent on its own expansion, we must face this sort of contradiction from functionalist arguments. Another example comes from some Marxist radical theories of education. Capitalism does not require a highly educated working class, so the theory goes, but it does require a well-socialized and docile working class. Schools then will serve the role of socializing and channeling people into capitalist society, but not of educating them. Now, this conclusion may be true, but the functionalist nature of the argument eclipses the mysterious and difficult part of the phenomenon. How does capitalism ensure this role for schools? When teachers try to teach, students try to learn, and so on. A third example is the role of the state. The capitalist state acts in the interest of the capitalist class. That is the theory. But theory cannot be convincing unless one can demonstrate the mechanism by which this occurs, especially because capitals do not have a habit of cooperating with each other, as the primary agent of each capital's existence is self-expansion and competition against other capitals. What one requires then are micro-foundations for the role of racism, education, and the state under capitalism. Other examples abound. In the cases when capitalism is guided, as if by an invisible hand, to coordinate its preservation in the ways mentioned, one requires an explanation of how anarchic capitals produce such a result. A second form of functionalism that exists among Marxists is the converse of the first form. If X has occurred, then X must be in the interest of capital. We again can take an example from education. Because we observe compulsory education, it must be that capital requires such for its reproduction. But this may not be the case. Compulsory education may exist because the working class fought for it. One can find many examples of this form of functionalism in Marxian work. The general consequence of the error is to attribute an omnipotence to the capitalist class that it does not possess in Marxian theory. The capitalist class is pushed along by historical developments. Not everything that happens under capitalism was planned by capitalism, nor is in capitalism's best interest. In fact, according to Marx, the general tide of historical development favors the working class. Again, a defense against this form of functionalism is a micro-foundations approach. There is a third form of functionalism among Marxists that strangely seems diametrically opposed to the first two forms. If the occurrence of X is necessary for the demise of capitalism, then X will come to pass. We can see the general rule of which these different functionalist forms are special cases if we phrase the general functionalist position this way. We postulate a certain outcome for the social system. Functionalism then takes the form of claiming that only events occur which lead to that outcome. In the first two forms of functionalism discussed, the outcome is the reproduction of capitalist relations. In the third form, the outcome is the transformation of capitalism into socialism. Perhaps the first two forms of functionalism are short-run variants, and the third form is a long-run variant of the general functionalist interpretation of Marxism. Examples of the third form of functionalism in Marxian economics are prevalent in crisis theory. The system must have crises because crisis is necessary for capitalist demise. The rate of profit must fall because only in this way can crisis be brought about. The working class must become impoverished because otherwise it will never perform its revolutionary task. Bourgeois democracy must transform itself into fascism because only fascism will heighten the contradictions of capitalism sufficiently to produce revolutionary transformation, which must occur. These arguments are less than convincing. The form of functionalism they invoke is similar to that of the utopian socialism of Marx's time, which postulated socialist transformation without a mechanism. Marx's method was to counter utopian thinking by trying to expose the mechanism that would bring the socialist transformation about. One second. Footnote. Since writing this, I have encountered a more complete discussion of functionalism in Elster, 1978. End footnote. Finally, the equilibrium method has been used in the models in this book. While I have defended the approach of mathematical modeling and the micro-foundations approach, I have less confidence about the equilibrium method. Many economists of my generation, like many economists of my generation, I'm strongly influenced by the power of the equilibrium method of examining a model when it is at rest, so to speak, in the sense that all the rules that describe how its parts work are simultaneously fulfilled. What is disturbing about the equilibrium method is that the equilibrium method pictures the typical position of the system as a position the system rarely or never enjoys. Of course, no sophisticated economic model builder would claim that economies are in equilibrium in the sense of static equilibrium model. A model is only an ideal type. However, there seems to be a deep contradiction between using models whose main analytical trick is to postulate a position that is precisely at variance with the most interesting and important aspects of capitalist economy as described by Marxian theory, its incessant contradictory motion. There is, therefore, the danger that if this intuition is correct, the equilibrium method will prevent one from seeing the most important aspects of the Marxian theory of capital. Knowing no other method, I use the equilibrium method with the vague thought that, when rereading these pages in 20 years, its obsolescence as a modeling tool for Marxian theory may be clear. I might add that there is plenty of precedent in Marx's modeling of his theory for the equilibrium method. Consider, for example, the notion of equalization of profit rates among capitals, or the models of balanced growth designed to show that capitalism was capable of reproducing itself. New section, summary. From the preceding discussion, it should now be clear what I am attempting. The goal is to convey my perception of aspects of Marxian economic theory by posing specific models. Furthermore, the aspects of the theory that are discussed are classical ones. There is no attempt to extend the theory to deal with new problems such as the question of exploitation under socialism discussed above. In chapters 1 and 2, the concern is with the Marxian notion of equilibrium and the theory of exploitation. A definition of equilibrium is proposed that includes not only the usual concept of competition of capital and profit maximization, or the accumulation of capital leading to an equalization of profit rates, but also formalizes the Marxian notion of the reproducibility of the economic system. The model is examined in a general equilibrium framework. Within this framework, exploitation is defined and the equivalence of exploitation and positive profits is shown. In Chapter 1, the model is developed from the usual Leontief-Sraffa-Morishima linear input-output specification of production. In Chapter 2, the model is extended to a more general production environment. It is assumed that production sets are convex sets. The purpose of this general treatment is to show that the Marxian theories of equilibrium and exploitation do not depend on the usual linear specification of production, but are very general, as general for all practical purposes as the neoclassical model, which has been developed for convex production sets. In addition to this main theorem, there are various sidelights in these chapters. In Chapter 1, there is a discussion of differential profit rates and imperfect competition in the linear model, and in Chapter 2, there is the modification of the exogenous subsistence bundle assumption, which is ubiquitous in Marxian mathematical models, and we allow workers' consumption to be socially determined by technology. In the first two chapters, one important market is missing, a credit market. In Chapter 3, this omission is rectified by postulating that capitalists can borrow and lend capital among themselves at an interest rate. This allows a discussion of the foundations of the equalization of profit rates in the Marxian model and the differences between the Marxian and, quote, neoclassical position on the rate of interest as a return to capital. These three chapters constitute the first part of the book. Chapters 4, 5, and 6 are the next part and are concerned with the theory of the falling rate of profit. In Chapter 4, the relation between the value and price rate of profit is studied, and it is shown that competitively induced technical innovations can only cause the equilibrium rate of profit to rise in a linear production model with only circulating capital. Technical innovations are described among two dimensions: whether they are viable, will competitive capitalists introduce them, and whether they are progressive, are they socially desirable. The relationship between the viable and progressive innovations is explored. One interesting result is that viable innovations are not necessarily progressive, nor are progressive innovations necessarily viable. At first glance, this appears to contradict a neoclassical theorem, as it implies that the invisible hand does not work very well. The exploration of this anomaly awaits the reader in Chapter 4. Despite an increasing awareness among Marxists of the rising rate of profit theorem of Chapter 4, which it should be pointed out is not original with this author, but has been discovered by various investigators over the past 40 years, models continue to be put forth to resurrect the falling rate of profit theory. Chapter 5 addresses itself to these models. The conclusion of the chapter is that none of the proposals is convincing. Perhaps the most important such models to evaluate are the ones involving fixed capital. It has been claimed by several authors that the rising rate of profit result is an artifact of pure circulating capital models, but in the presence of fixed capital, competitive innovation can lead to a falling rate of profit. This position is rebutted in Chapter 5 by a theorem which states that in a general model with fixed capital, the von Neumann activity analysis model, competitive innovations result in a rising rate of profit. There seems no hope for a theory of the falling rate of profit within the strict confines of the environment that Marx suggested as relevant. One of these confines is the assumption that the real wage remains fixed before and after technical innovation. Indeed, if the real wage rises, the rate of profit may fall with technical change. In Chapter 6, it is shown that if the real wage increases after technical change, so that workers maintain the same relative share in net product that they had in the old equilibrium, then innovations that were competitively introduced will cause the rate of profit to fall. This focuses attention on the relationship between technical change and induced changes in the real wage, which is a topic addressed in contemporary Marxian discussions of the labor process. The chapter concludes by showing how these modern concerns with the nature of technical change mesh with the classical questions of the falling rate of profit. Chapters 7 and 8 discuss the transformation problem. Already in chapters 1 to 3, it has become clear that the Marxian theory of exploitation can be constructed completely independently of the labor theory of value as a theory of exchange. In Chapter 7, this important point is expanded and specifically confronted. It is maintained that Marx used the labor theory of value as a theory of exchange at some level of abstraction, and his theory of exploitation was then developed as a corollary to the exchange theory. That is, the theory of exchange was the conduit through which the labor theory of value was brought to bear in deriving the theory of exploitation. In Chapter 7, the point is made that the role of the labor theory of value in the theory of exploitation can be developed entirely independently of its role in Marx's exchange theory. It is maintained that the most fruitful interpretation of Marxian value theory entails discarding the labor theory of value and its role as exchange theory and maintaining it only in its independent role in the exploitation theory. In doing this, we are also led to an interpretation of the logical status of the subsistence wage concept in Marx, and in the reformulation of Marxian value theory, we are able to discard the subsistence notion. This approach enables also a new interpretation of the Marxian, quote, law of value, which is presented as a theorem in Chapter 7. This chapter will no doubt be viewed with some controversy. It is maintained that the, quote, transformation problem, end quote, is most fruitfully resolved by the model presented. Chapter 8 is a technical study of what I called the, quote, transformation correspondence, end quote, or what I have called the, quote, transformation correspondence, end quote, is a continuation of the model of Chapter 9 and asks, what is the range of prices that can correspond to a given social rate of exploitation? Answering this question provides some insight into the conventional approach to the transformation problem and allows comment on various issues such as the relative importance of, quote, marginal utilities and, quote, class struggle in determining relative prices. In the general equilibrium models of chapters 1 to 3, the concern was with the Marxian theory of value and exploitation. As such, the model in those chapters abstracted from questions of unemployment, state expenditures, and the possibilities of a discrepancy between supply and demand. In Chapter 9, we model various classical Marxian theories of crisis by introducing these aspects into a model. First, simple reproduction is studied, a situation where capitalists consume the entire surplus. Then extended reproduction is studied. These Marxian notions are modeled. An industrial reserve army in general exists, which puts downward pressure on the real wage. The unemployed are supported at some subsistence level by a state tax on profits. There is, in general, a discrepancy between ex post and ex ante investment. Perhaps this last notion in this form is better credited to Keynes than to Marx, although Marx was an ardent opponent of Say's law. It is shown that the industrial reserve army's effect on wages can lead to a profit squeeze crisis. The state's role as taxer of profits can lead to a fiscal crisis, and the possible discrepancy between actual savings and desired investment can lead to a realization of underconsumption crisis. The model is schematically represented in a convenient diagram that enables one to see how the various crises occur. Some advice on how to read this book would perhaps be useful. I have tried to avoid a misleading simplicity, which could be achieved by stating theorems or their proofs imprecisely. For the reader who wishes to follow the argument in detail, such a simplicity would lead only to confusion. The cost of my approach is that the book does not make for casual reading. I have tried to compensate for this by providing ample discussion of the implications and motivations of theorems. I hope the book can be read at two levels. One level skips the proofs of theorems. The reader who follows both the proofs and the surrounding discussion will find that the level of familiarity assumed with results used in mathematical economics, jumps abruptly in the proofs. In addition, some chapters are easier than others. Chapters 2, 3, and 8 are more technical than the rest. The book is not intended as a first exposure to mathematical Marxian economics. In general, I have avoided developing models that are available from other authors and have concentrated on what I hope are fresh approaches. The reader who has not seen the Leontiev, Sraffa, Morishima approach to the labor theory of value and prices of production will probably have a difficult time. Two recent books that provide a clear and elementary presentation of the mathematics and economics of linear models relevant for Marxian analysis are Passinetti, 1977, and Steedman, 1977. More advanced treatments can be found, for instance, in Nikado, 1968, and Schwartz, 1961. The other kind of mathematics used in this book is the apparatus of fixed-point theorems and continuous correspondences, which is useful for the study of general equilibrium. The most succinct summary of these tools is to be found in De Breu, 1973. Another classic source is Arrow and Hahn, 1971. All right, everybody, that is the end of the introduction to Johnny Roemer's Analytical Foundations of Marxian Economic Theory. Thank you so much for listening.